How to escape the national humiliation. In this presentation, we will look at the concept of national humiliation, nationalism, and humiliation as separate topics. We will look at how nationalism can spin out of control and the way the CCP has handled COVID. In summary, we'll look at how a totalitarian system does not incentivize truth, only the control of the narrative supply. In January 2020, a true national humiliation took place in China. This was probably the greatest national humiliation for the country since Tiananmen Square in 1989. It was particularly painful because it was a homegrown humiliation with no foreigners to blame, and it cut to the core of the deficiencies in the CCP's totalitarian information feedback system. The disincentives for speaking the truth were symbolised by the arrest of Dr. Li Wenliang. He was charged with spreading lies and causing trouble for doing his job as a doctor by sending a private message to his colleagues with his concerns about a dangerous new virus. This is the sort of day that should live in infamy in contemporary Chinese history. Turning to nationalism itself as a concept, it is, of course, universal, but dates back in particular to the establishment of the Westphalian system. But it's used universally today. It's not a uniquely Chinese concept, as Brexit and MAGA in America would testify. It's a particularly useful concept for a government because it can unify the nation so effectively. Nationalism, doing what's good for the country, is perceived by the public as both a true and a good concept. No one's going to go against a leader who tries to do the best for the country. At the same time, it's actually a popular consumerist feature of a capitalist society. The public love to watch programmes about the Queen in Britain, or in China, endless dramas about World War II and the war against the Japanese. It is also an extremely cheap method of control. A good example is national events usually have volunteers for them, such as the Olympics, and at the same time, nationalism is a great tool to distract the population from domestic problems. If you've got domestic trouble, stir up a bit of tension abroad with an enemy or the foreigners, and it will generally keep people together. For example, in Britain, the immigrant narratives, Trump's Mexican rapist, and in China, that hackneyed trope of the Japanese. National humiliation was originally developed as a concept in China in the 1910s and 1920s. More, I would argue, as a reaction to the incompetence of the Qing dynasty and the imperial system, rather than being entirely anti-foreigner. The May the 4th movement in 1919 was both anti-Japanese, but at the same time very much against the Confucian ethico-superior state of the emperor before, and seeking to gain Western-style reforms for the country. The national humiliation narrative was later revived in the 1990s after Tiananmen to again unite the country. Of course, I'm not here ignoring the atrocities that the Japanese committed in World War II, but we will look at this concept, whether it was national humiliation or whether there is a better way to describe that event. Humiliation, again, is a very effective tool for a government to use, particularly a one-party state. It's an extremely emotional argument against which it is almost impossible to argue rationally. It also embodies negative values. The idea of remembering humiliation rather than, say, the atrocious acts and trying not to commit them again, which is more the narrative in the West to do with the Nazis. Or take, for example, the UK's attitude to remembrance, the idea of lest we forget, or remember the 5th of November. You're remembering not to sort of do bad things, or the fact that hundreds of thousands, millions of soldiers laid down their lives to protect the freedom we have today. Whereas China, in the national humiliation narrative, zeroes in really on the weakness of the victim rather than the strength of the aggressor or the atrocities of the aggressor. It's saying China was so weak it couldn't stand up. And as a negative value, its positive alternative, its sort of correction, is really one of three things: vengeance, or salvation, or triumph. So, with nationalism and the national humiliation narrative, which is brainwashed into children from birth in China, it puts the leadership in a rather difficult position. The theory of social categorization describes how opinions tend to shift towards the extremes, and I think this is what we're seeing in China now. Xi Jinping has essentially vowed to bring Taiwan back, reunify Taiwan within the next, let's say, 10, at the most, 15 years. And the people want it to happen. At the same time, the hardliners and the PLA feel ready to fight. And the pressure here is that if Xi Jinping doesn't give the order to attack, then the hardliners can stir up the people at the same time as putting pressure on him, saying, well, look, if you're not going to invade, we'll replace you with someone who damn well will. And you can see how this spirals out of control, because you've got the one-party state, and at the same time, they're all brainwashed into believing that it is their God-given right to reunify Taiwan. And ironically, what we're seeing here with China is runaway nationalism. And it's imitating its most hated enemy, Japan of the 1930s. And the great risk is that Gekokujo style overturning of the leadership by the military. I realise the tone of this presentation takes what feels like an anti-China angle, and rightly the CCP blends itself so tightly with nationalism that any slight to the CCP is seen as one to China at the same time. But putting ourselves in the CCP's shoes, trapped as they are in this national humiliation narrative, I don't think many of us would act particularly differently. It's a good question to ask yourself: if you were in charge, is there any other way to do it? Now, remembering since the 1990s, nationalism and the national humiliation narrative has been something that's really kept the country together. We can see it in action more recently. So, COVID disaster became the COVID triumph. Because the CCP can lock up the country, and because they can control the narrative supply so effectively, the reaction to the COVID disaster became, in a Churchillian, Dunkirk-esque rhetorical legerdemain, the COVID triumph, not only justifying the CCP's rule, but also the superiority of the totalitarian system itself over any non-Chinese system. They showed complete mastery of narrative control. The question is, what will happen in the future? Is there any way to escape or complete the national humiliation narrative? And it's simple. Invade Taiwan and conquer Japan. And I say this usually with a Western reaction of people scoffing or laughing, but Chinese will nod their heads and agree completely. And the reason for it is this: there is really no length to which China will not go to reunify Taiwan, particularly because of this national humiliation narrative. They've got to prove their strength, and taking Taiwan back is one way. At the same time, the humiliation the party historians describe that Japan inflicted on China in the 1930s gives China every right to go back and re-inflict that same humiliation. Now China is strong. Now China has stood up. Now China can hit back and go to Japan and do the same again. So, we can see this sort of toxic environment brewing in China, and the outcome, in my opinion, can only be destructive.